Hello, everybody. My name's Thomas Fracken. This is the Roundtable Chats Podcast, episode 6. I'm thrilled, excited to have my next guest, Cara Cruickshank. Cara is a social entrepreneur. She's an artistic director, and she's the artistic director and producer of Café de la Culture, the venue for Visionaries. Recently, she's been running the Courageous Vulnerability Tour. Cara, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
So first question I like to ask my guests is, what are you grateful for?
So many things. Um, One of the things I'm grateful for is being part of a lot of different communities around the world and across the country. And I'm super, super grateful for diversity. And when I say diversity, I obviously mean culturally, but also just the diversity of environments and experiences, um, individuals, communities, and perspectives that life offers, and that the world offers, because I find all of it deeply enriching as a human being, and that's a huge part of what drives my work.
Yeah, excellent. And how have you been able to, I guess, cultivate diversity? I mean, were you kind of born in a background that was diverse, or why do you think diversity is so important?
Yeah, I grew up upstate in New York, close to Woodstock, the town of Woodstock, and uh, definitely grew up in a very kind of unconventional way where I was sort of, my immediate community was primarily white, semi-conservative,
Mm,
um, but there was also like a lot of intermingling with bohemian culture, and my family is very bohemian and liberal. But my parents were both coming from very diverse backgrounds. My father is American with Irish, Scottish heritage and was born in Mumbai, India, and raised by a nanny from Goa. And my
wow.
mother is Brazilian American, born in New York, and raised by German nannies, and grew up speaking German and traveling to Germany every summer. Um, and then, in addition to that, a lot of my immediate community in New York was Jewish. I was raised Catholic, part time, and then my parents had lived in a Kundalini yoga ashram before I was born. So my mother was sort of making us go to church, but then also teaching us the rest of the week about reincarnation and karma and Eastern spirituality. And my parents were separated when I was at an early age, so we would kind of have those experiences and
Mm.
then go to my dad's on the weekends and he'd be like, it's all bullshit. um, he's very anti-institutional, very
Mm.
anti-religion, so we kind of got a lot of different flavors.
Yeah, seriously.
And then, there are also some pretty prominent Buddhist communities in the area I grew up in. And my mother had a lot of friends from different countries coming and going and playing music at our house, and people from Colombia and Brazil and Argentina,
Wow,
um,
it's incredible.
and various other countries, and we had friends from Kenya, and so it was just like, to me, I grew up with the perspective that diversity is normal
Mm.
and something to be celebrated and enjoyed, and something very enriching. And I didn't have any perception of hierarchy in,
Hmm.
my sort of bubble of the world. I think primarily due to my own familial upbringing, but yeah, I really wasn't exposed to sort of social injustice per se, other than kind of I think the only real social injustice I perceived as a kid growing up, it was not racially based, it was socioeconomically based, which of course intersect. But
Yes.
in this case, I was growing up in an area that's primarily white. Most of the black kids that I knew had at least one white parent, so they were growing up with kind of a white identity in a sense.
Right.
And so, there was no hierarchy based on color, but very much so based on income and socioeconomic status. White trash, so to speak,
Right.
versus middle class or middle upper class. So I think I had vague perceptions of that, or kids, at school being ridiculed for being gay. That was another hierarchy of like hetero and gay. But the whole race thing, I had no connection or exposure to in terms of that being a thing until I was quite a bit older, and had some shocking intersections with racist white friends, and
Right.
I had never heard or seen anything like it, and it was deeply disturbing to me, and rather foreign of a concept. But also being, as it's been described, ethnic myself, in that I have dark hair and dark eyes, and can be perceived as many different types of cultures. Like I'm often mistaken for Middle Eastern or Israeli or any number of things, North African. I also had some direct biases aimed at me at a couple of different junctures in my childhood interacting with people, and so that actually was probably my first awakening to, people have a thing about that, like
Right. Yeah.
like
It's
if
like
you're
a rude awakening.
from some certain places, like in some people's eyes, or if you're just a little too tan or whatever from the sun, or otherwise, some people take issue with that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, that's a little bit about my relationship with diversity.
Yeah, no, that was really good. I mean, one thing I just wanted to ask you as a follow-up is, was it difficult not cultivating, but building an identity when you're exposed to so many cultures? Like, growing up, did you ever wonder, like, who am I? I mean, I guess maybe a lot of teenagers feel like that, but like, what would you use maybe as an anchor? Or how would you define yourself even, or identify when exposed to so many cultures and religions and spiritual beliefs and philosophies? Like,
I love that question. I don't know if anyone has ever asked it that directly, but it's something I've certainly explored myself. And so, yeah, I think, for me, I don't think I primarily identified as American as a kid, because my mother was always, I think because of her cultural upbringing, she was born in New York, but she was always criticizing Americans as though we were something else. And so, I grew up speaking two languages, both English and Portuguese, and but there was sort of this kind of fringe feeling in any community I was part of. I also grew up a professional actor, and was living in a tiny town of 300 people or so, but then commuting to New York City a couple times a week for auditions and acting gigs and performances. And I I think I never felt fully part of thespian culture. I never felt fully part of the culture at school. There was always a bit of I enjoy this. I can relate to it in some ways, this community. I see some commonalities that I have with other people, but yet this is not fully who I am. You know, there's more. And I think, you know, the question, who am I? I feel like I'm still asking that question in a
Yeah,
sense.
sure.
There are a lot of layers to that question beyond, you know, identity politics. But that's also a deep spiritual question and existential
It's a lot,
question.
yeah.
But yeah, I think to me, you absolutely hit on something very true, which is that in embracing diversity and enjoying the sharing of many identities, you also belong to none of them in a sense. And that can be a very lone wolf kind of feeling, which ironically, as a community builder, which is the primary foundation of my work and has always been, no matter what field I've worked in as an entrepreneur, you know, I've always had a very continuous relationship with loneliness, and I think that's in a way part and parcel of choosing or gravitating to relating to many different kinds of people and many different communities. You never quite belong. You're sort of part of all of them and part of none of them at the same time.
Yeah, no, I mean the one thing I can resonate with is like not feeling like I belong anywhere, in the sense that I'm half French and half America, but I grew up in America, and so I mean I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, which is very homogeneous, very white, and very kind of narrow, and in that sense, and so I didn't there was nobody really French in my elementary school, middle school, or high school. But even if there was somebody who's French, I don't think I would belong necessarily with them, because I'm only half French. I've only experienced some of that. I haven't been fully absorbed in that culture. So I kind of resonate with not knowing exactly where I belong, like that piece, coming from different
Right.
backgrounds.
And yeah, that's definitely a prevailing theme for people who have parents of two different cultures.
Right.
And in my case, both of my parents were American born, but my mother was identifying more as Brazilian throughout her life than American in many ways. Certainly culturally, you know, not necessarily on every level, but I, you know, I spent a lot of years traveling to Brazil to, you know, have a deeper relationship and understanding of that part of my own background and identity. And so I'm very familiar with that feeling of bouncing between two cultures that you strongly identify with in very different ways. And, you know, it does at times feel like you are two people. And I think that's a lot of what led me to spend more time and eventually live in France is for me, French culture is the amalgamation of both my Latin and, you know, kind of Western European backgrounds and identities. So that's like a really kind of cool blend. You know, France is juxtaposed, you know, it just perfectly situated between Germany and Italy.
Right.
And really has both of those cultures and philosophies and cultural values blend together in a way that seems to speak to those parts of me.
Yeah, that's really cool. Just going deeper into France, I mean, my mom was born in Marseille, and so I'd visit Marseille a lot in the south of France when I was younger, and still do now. But with Marseille, like you have the German and Italian influences, but also you have all these Northern African influences as well. I mean,
Absolutely,
it's so
yeah. Well,
diverse.
certainly in Paris, that's very present as
Yeah,
well.
right.
Actually, the neighborhood I live in there is just a couple blocks from um, a very North African plus maybe Eastern African community, and there's certainly I love it for that, again, diversity of just
Yeah.
everything intersecting, and what saddens me about it is that the city itself and the country itself has not effectively on any level figured out how to embrace that diversity in a socially, politically, and community healthy way. So you have this incredible intersection of culture, but everybody's very much, or certainly the majority of people are very much staying among whom they culturally identify with, and very segregated. There's a lot of cultural unknowns between different communities. There's a lot of misunderstanding and distrust and edginess, and of course the refugee and immigrant communities, like many countries around the world right now, are arriving but not really being welcomed, except for amazing local Native individuals who are working on grassroots levels through nonprofits to pool together resources to welcome whoever they can. But other than that, as far as the city's efforts and the federal organization of bringing communities together to benefit by one another and enrich one another, we've got a long way to go in both the U.S. and France and many other places. There are a few countries that are beginning to figure it out, but even they have, from what I've seen in media and documentary film, there's still a tremendous amount of inclusion that needs to be happening, and developed, and resources offered, because to invite people who are walking in with nothing, literally nothing in hand from their history or their past or their day-to-day survival, and arrive in a new country where they know that their whole entire trajectory from then on is going to be limited resources and less access to the normal human dignity necessities that the other people around them have immediate access to. And anyway, maybe I digress, but that's a huge subject that definitely needs much more conversation and attention and insightful action.
Yeah, no, I agree. Something I was going to add to that is I think it's so important for our listeners and people in general to live in communities that are very diverse and to engage with people with different religious views and different ethnic backgrounds and different histories and cultures and stories, because one thing that bothers me, at least about Boulder, Colorado, is that some people I know like to say like how inclusive it is and how tolerant it is. I'm like, well, it's easy to do that if you're in a homogeneous community. It's much more difficult and challenging to bring together people from all over the world and all these different backgrounds, and even have histories of aggression and violence and conflict with each other, bring everyone together and then have a dialogue and engage and build a community off of that and be inclusive. I mean, that's much more challenging. And so I think...
Well, much more challenging to some. I mean,
Right.
it doesn't have to be, and there are tried and true systemized ways to do that simply, easily, and effectively, and we know that because of how much history we have behind us,
Right.
In the world, and how many times that's been demonstrated by incredible leaders like Mandela and Oprah and and many others, that effectively build those bridges and make that happen. I think creating microcosm versions of that is absolutely the first step, because the hardness of merging people of different backgrounds and communities together comes from I think the concept of it being hard is thinking of it on massive levels or macro levels.
Right.
But when you do it person by person, circle by circle, it's really not hard.
Right.
And when you look at it, just on a primary school level, like you put a bunch of kindergartners together in a room, and maybe some of them are different colors, and some of them come from families of different faiths, and some of them have no money, and some of them have lots of money. You take any given public elementary school, you throw a bunch of kids in a room together and say, all right, you guys are on your own, do your thing.
Yeah, right. Figure it out.
That's totally hit or miss. Some kids might know how to do that. Some kids might not. Some kids might come from a background of bullying, and have to reenact that to get through the day, and some kids might be traumatized by that. But you put one sensible adult in the room who knows how to introduce kids to each other and show them things they have in common and give them common goals to work towards together as a team, and suddenly you have an incredible ecosystem of kids helping each other out and benefiting by each other's skill sets and cheering each other up when they're feeling down and learning how to communicate well with one another. And that actually can be an incredible preventative measure from a lot of the problems that we're dealing with in the world. Not only to do that in classrooms, but to do that on adult levels in one's own community. And, to the point of Boulder being a very homogenous town, I agree. I grew up in the Woodstock, New York area, but then migrated to Boulder for high school years and some college, and it's been a home base for me ever since. So it's a town I know well and spent a lot of time in as well. My knowledge of Boulder is that I think it's like 2% Black.
Yeah. Like that, yeah.
And maybe 13% Mexican, and a small percentage Asian, and so forth. However, my own experience there is very different, because for most of the years I've lived there, I've studied West African dance and been very immersed in Ghanaian community, the West African community at large there, which relatively to other big cities is small, but big enough that there's certainly a community there. And likewise, I studied a lot of Latin dances, so I was surrounded by Mexicans and Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Brazilians, so my day-to-day reality in a city even as white and homogenous as Boulder is incredibly culturally diverse. And when I was a kid, I was hopping around, checking out different places of worship and learning about different religions just out of curiosity, which led me to meet people of other faiths and other countries. And so, my own perception of a day-to-day reality there was something incredibly culturally enriching and diverse. And, I have friends from every every continent probably in Boulder. But you step back and look at the bigger picture. That's not
Right.
necessarily every white person in Boulder's experience, but you can choose to create that wherever you are,
Right.
And bridge those gaps on a person by person basis.
Mm.
I think that's a good thing to remember.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, when I think back to it, maybe it was less diverse than my elementary and middle school, but when I did go to Fairview High School in Boulder, I didn't notice at the time. I mean, I wasn't like consciously choosing like, okay, I'm gonna be friends with this person because they're more diverse than somebody else, whatever that means. But like when I look back to it, actually, a lot of my friends were from different countries and from South America and from different European countries and from India and different Asian countries. And I think actually one platform that I found late in high school and that I've cultivated since is the whole spoken word community. And through that, actually, I was able to find a lot of diversity. And recently, I've been going to more spoken word events, but what I've always been gravitated towards it, but I never realized why. And then recently, I realized it's just like one of the most honest platforms in a sense. It's a place where you can go in society where people can just really let out what's inside and speak their truth in a way that maybe they can in other places. And I guess you can do this in art in large, but I really found a sanctuary even in spoken word. And I wanted to ask more about your background and even creativity. I mean, I'm just looking at your LinkedIn for education. It says music, theater, and dance at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so, I mean, what is creativity to you, and how long have you been cultivating that, and how's that been?
Yeah, that was for my whole one semester of
college. Yeah.
and I dropped out and became an entrepreneur at 20.
Wow. Okay.
Or 21.
That's amazing.
So, so your question was regarding my background in the arts?
Yeah, pretty much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, according to my mother and any other adult that knew me then, the minute I could walk, I was dancing, and the minute I could talk, I was singing, and the minute I learned that kids were allowed to perform on stage and in film, I was looking for any opportunity, and kind of was lucky to grow up with a mother who understood my need for artistic expression, and by need I mean almost every minute of every day.
Wow.
I don't mean like, ballet class once a week
Yeah.
kind of thing, but I was like, absolutely, it was an insatiable drive from the minute I could carry a conversation and get around. So my grandmother had been, my mother comes from a lineage of very accomplished artists in music and in poetry, and so she was not foreign to that as a career path or as a personal path, and so maybe that allowed her to be more supportive of and understanding of that. I'm not sure my father fully got it on all levels, but my mother did, and she was willing to facilitate pretty much anything I set my mind to doing. And from an early age, that started with ballet classes, and then merged into improvisational theater classes at school with an incredible mentor, Galen Blum, and then the minute I heard there was community theater and that kids could audition, I was there, and I think my first production was age 7, and then I discovered that there was a theater in Woodstock, a historical theater that did summer stock productions with professional troupes of actors from July to August or so, and lucky for me, they were traveling troops of equity actors, but they were locally curating and casting children for each production so that the kids didn't have to travel.
Okay.
And so I could be part of these professional productions and interact with professional actors and work with them. So I started doing that at age 8 and 9 all summer long. We would do, multiple shows with different troupes coming through, and I had a blast and learned a lot. And my first professional audition was for Les Misérables on Broadway.
Oh, wow.
Which I got, and then had that experience, and then continued to do more theater and singing engagements. I sang at the United Nations General Assembly a couple different times, sometimes in ensembles and choirs, and sometimes solo for a couple of years, and then did a regional tour of The Sound of Music between 6th and 7th grade that went all over the East Coast. And so I grew up studying dance of many different forms, tap and jazz and ballet, and then later modern. Fell in love with West African dance as a teenager and studied first dance from Guinea and Ivory Coast, and then dabbled in dance from Senegal, which is not an easy dance form.
I never heard of that. Yeah, what's that like?
And then focused in on Ghanaian dance for a lot of years. Dance from Senegal is beautiful. There's a lot of hip motions and knee motions that are very specific and to that culture of dance, and very technically difficult to do until you acclimate to it, which I never did. So yeah, and then along the way, kind of dabbled in salsa and samba, and studied capoeira for some years as a young adult. Yoga, studied Ashtanga yoga with a Pakistani friend for quite a while, and so yeah, dance has been a very big part of my life. I taught dance to youth and teenagers for many years in New York, and adults, and never wanted to do it professionally in a company, because similar in my trajectory of my acting career, I wanted to maintain artistic freedom no matter what I did in the arts, and that led me to be doing more choreography and acting. I mean, choreography, directing, and producing and writing, so that I could always be creating work rather than crafting myself into somebody else's creative work. So that for me was just a more freeing path that I took, and I feel very grateful to have found ways to continuously do that, because it absolutely feeds my soul. And I do enjoy collaborations and being part of other people's work at times, but not being dependent on someone else's vision of what I might fit as a role or as a type or as a character. To me, it felt like artistic death. At a young age, when I went to New York City to see if I wanted to become a professional actor as an adult, and I was really, I just didn't resonate with the idea of having to play one role for best case scenario is you play one role 8 shows a week for a minimum of a year contract. And I felt like for who I am and my nature, that would be very suffocating. I'm not a routine person. I'm not very good with repetition and monotony.
You're right.
Other people find, I think, their groove in that, and can make it a different experience every show. And but yeah, the longest run I did with a play was 3 months, and I was done by the end of doing 3 months of the same show, 8 shows
Oh,
a week.
can only imagine. Oh my
So
God.
I have admiration and respect and
Mm,
awe for those artists who can do that. It's just not my cup of tea.
yeah, sure.
So I did perform in ensembles, and I mean, I grew up an actor, so I performed in many other people's productions for many years, and was part of two dance troupes of West African dance, and was part of an Afro pop band for a while, and certainly found a lot of joy fitting into other people's direction and artistic vision. But at the end of the day, the greatest joy I get is by creating art from scratch and building community around that. And my expression as a director is very collaborative with actors and dancers, and really having them co-create with me in terms of highlighting their best work and challenging them to stretch and try new things, but also letting them and encouraging them to find their own greatest artistic freedom in the work they're doing with me whenever possible, and really cultivate that. So that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, it's funny. So you answered a question I was gonna ask you. I was gonna ask you about your routine, how you do all these things. Your routine is no routine, and like
No
much more
routine
fluid.
at all.
Yeah, that's incredible. I love that.
Certainly, I have certain modular. I would describe my work as modular. So I have touchstone points that I utilize, and tools in my toolkit, and best practices for sure. But in terms of how those things are put together and operate and systemization, it's a slightly different combination every time depending on who I'm working with and what the moment calls for. So I like to keep things as fluid and dynamic as possible, because that's where inspiration comes in. And if things are too predictable and systemized, that can suffocate the artistic process, and it can prohibit inspiration.
Yeah.
Of course, there are artists who absolutely would disagree with me and say the opposite, and I respect that totally.
Sure.
I'm just speaking from my own process.
Yeah, of course. Something I want to ask. So, how did you transition from you're doing so many incredible things in music and dance and art. Where did Café de la Culture come from? Like, how did that idea come about? When did you start doing that? I mean, it seems like quite a shift, right? I mean, it's amazing.
So, yeah, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no, sort of a natural trajectory from what I had done before. But a lot of my work for many years was educationally based. So I was running a kindergarten to 12th grade youth theater for about 8 or 9 years. So kind of a one-room schoolhouse youth theater, if you will, usually comprised of, anywhere from 20 to 30 kids, ranging in ages from 5 to 18, doing productions together. So that was a very educational, great education for me as director and producer as well to do that. But I was also doing educational and curricular design as an artist in residency in public schools throughout New York State and in Colorado. And I ran independent summer camps, summer day camps for 11 years between New York and Colorado, which focused on arts and culture and outdoor education through mentorship. So I was working with an incredible array of professionals of many ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, of many disciplines and fields, to mentor the kids I was working with in my summer camps and in my theater endeavors. And so there was always this theme of of cultural amalgamation and blending and multidisciplinary education.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I myself went to 5 high schools in 4 years, some of them private, some of them public. So my own education was pretty eclectic, you know, between missing a lot of school for the sake of my theater career growing up, and then, you know, going to a lot of different schools with a lot of different types of student populations and environments and philosophies on education. So that, you know, piqued an interest in me of, again, this theme of diversity and doing things different ways and experimenting and blending. And so I think, you know, my work is strongly based in education, in cultural studies, in the arts, in community building and creating moments that bring people of diverse backgrounds together. So to gravitate to the concept of literary salons was kind of, in a way, a no-brainer
right.
when you look at that picture. But, you know, it was very much due to travel I was doing in Europe over the years as just a tourist, so to speak. But my kind of tourism is not typical in that I don't go to countries and stay in resorts or hotels and do tourist guided groups. My level of tourism is couch surfing with locals and or staying in, you know, Airbnb rooms in somebody's home and getting a pulse of, you know, what's happening on the local level and making friends, and learning, you know, being guided from the inside to what's happening, and learning the culture from the inside in that sense. And I took a lot of trips over the years to Spain and Italy and Turkey and France especially. I kept gravitating to, again, I think because of the blend of culture that it offers that I found very relatable. And there's a big history in France of literary salons,
right,
and philosophical discourse, and people of differing opinions and differing backgrounds to come together and discuss and debate and explore and change each other's minds. And I love that tradition. I think that's a really healthy tradition, to be always questioning our own values and beliefs and see where we can still grow and develop and discover, no matter who we are, no matter where we are, and no matter what community we're part of. If there is not that engagement in exploration and the freedom to question, that's true democracy. And so no matter how small or big one's community, and whether that's religion and faith-based or whether that's culturally based or otherwise, I think, you know, that's something that's extremely important to me as a free person. So I was, you know, really intrigued by that tradition in France, which ultimately came out of the Middle East. I think Persia had a tradition of literary salons in the Middle Ages, when that was the hub of, Iraq and Iran were, and countries in that part of the world were, you know, Egypt. I mean, there was so much going on in science and medicine and literature, and that was the civilized world. Meanwhile, back on the farm in Western Europe, it was all tribal wars and pillaging and raping and Vikings and plagues and so that those practices, so the interesting thing of the philosophical salons is that they were always hosted by women.
Mm.
And from what I've read, even in the Middle East, where they were born from, it was women hosting them. And it was a way for women to get a higher education. Now, in Europe, I know less about I only know very vague bits and pieces of how it originated in Persia and Iraq, but I know that by the time it migrated into Western Europe, it was women of means who had the ability to host them because they had homes to invite people into and, the means to offer some refreshments and keep people there and keep them fed. So, but women of means were forbidden education as well as lower class women. So this was their way of pulling what resources they had to bring in well-informed people of their era and have discourse and ask questions and learn. And so in that tradition, from what I understand, men of all disciplines. I'm not sure about cultural backgrounds. I would hope it would be that too. But men of varying disciplines. So men in philosophy, men in science, men in religion and the arts, and writers and inventors were invited to the salon, and this was really taking off in Europe in the 18th century, and particularly in France. I think there were salons happening in Italy and Spain and perhaps other countries, but France was where it really took hold in a big way, and Paris in particularly. But the hierarchies were strong between disciplines. So, if you were a philosopher or a scientist, you were high on the totem pole. If you were a priest, very, very high. If you were an artist, you were scum of the earth.
Right, yeah.
And, if you were a female artist, you were a whore, literally, in some cases, out of necessity for survival, and figuratively in other cases. But you were as good as a whore in the worst context of that word, and you were not esteemed at all in society. So, and if you died, you were likely to be uncelebrated and thrown on a pile kind of thing.
Right.
So in the salon, all men were equal. So the hierarchy was left at the doorstep, and everyone could interact and discuss as equals. So that's a very unusual model for those times,
right?
When social status and hierarchy were extremely emphasized and cultivated and enforced. It was the feudal times of lords and peasants and all of that. So, to have this one forum where people could mingle and come together outside of that is pretty interesting. And that it was hosted by a woman who wanted to learn and educate herself is also very interesting. So anyway, Café de la Culture was born out of learning a bit about that, attending different salons around Paris over the years, mostly hosted by women, occasionally hosted by men, but seemingly always hosted by American or Canadian expats living in Paris, and wanting to continue that tradition. So Paris in particular, has a very long history of American expats and Anglo expats coming in and preserving French culture,
That's interesting.
out of nostalgia of what they know of French history, and Parisians in particular, and French people are very on board with that. They typically, generally, very much enjoy the way in which Anglo expats come in and preserve French history and culture. I think they like to participate. They get a kick out of it, and I think they appreciate it on a lot of levels. So they're very open to that, and so I had the experience of attending a number of these kinds of events of different forms and varieties, and really dug it. I just thought it was great. And eventually I transitioned out of my work in education in New York and went to Boulder for kind of a sabbatical period to recalibrate and figure out what I wanted to do next, which is never an easy process to kind of suddenly step out of a career path that you've been on for a while and then say, okay, what, not this anymore, what now? That can be both a daunting thing
right.
and an exciting thing. And so I went for a year. I call it a sabbatical, but it was a paid one. So, I went for a year of being sort of a bit lost in terms of my upcoming goals and path, and very much broke.
Right.
And so I couldn't travel for that year, and I was missing Europe a lot, and missing my friends in Europe and the kinds of social exchanges I was growing accustomed to having for at least a couple months a year. And I just was trying to think of a way I could bring a little bit of European culture to me, since I couldn't go there. And a friend one day said, Cara, a friend who had lived in Spain for some years and was now Boulder based as well, approached me one day and said, Cara, couldn't you create an evening where we could just sit with a group of great thinkers and have deep discussions and drink wine and have courses of food, and it could just feel like Europe for a night, in the way that people come together, and there's no schedule and there's no sense of time, and the conversation inevitably goes into philosophical existential discourse, and can you create a night like that? And I was like, yes, I can.
Yes.
Indeed, I can. And I think her vision was that, I'd sort of handpick 12 or so people to a table and cook a dinner and grab a couple bottles of wine and light some candles, and that would be our night. But the theater director in me said otherwise. And before I knew it, I was creating a literary salon. I had gotten interested in cooking Mediterranean food at the time, and gotten a lot of books out from the library, and was experimenting with hummuses and tapenades and rose-flavored dishes and pomegranate infused this and that, and I wanted an excuse to cook a lot of Mediterranean food for starters. So I was like, okay, what would be a good central topic that would necessitate a lot of Mediterranean food? And to me at the time, the obvious answer was Rumi. So I called the night Ruminating Rumi, an evening exploring the mystic poets. So we threw Hafiz in there too, and then I got carried away, having been an event producer for some years already, and a theater director and producer for some years. And I created a night which would be an experience stepping into a timeless place, and I wanted people to leave their shoes at the door and come into an environment where they were transported to a Persian or Moroccan tea house experience. And so that's exactly what I, with the help of many community members, created. Low tables and lanterns and cushions and pillows and fabrics from Afghanistan and India, and rugs, and we had world-class musicians, notably including Christine Sophia and Cameron Powers from Musical Ambassadors of Peace, which is the nonprofit organization that now fiscally sponsors Café de la Culture. But they are incredible they're Americans who play Arabic music, and folk music from all parts of the Arabic world, Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and Iraq, Iran, and other countries. And they go around the world playing music for refugees and poor people, and they were in Baghdad just after the bombings playing folk music on the streets, and they were in Egypt during the revolution playing for Egyptians, and they work with Yazidi female refugees who have been rescued from ISIS as sex slaves, and through music help them heal and restore their lives. And so they were two of the musicians at my very first salon, and that's actually how we met, was through a mutual friend who suggested I invite them to come and play. And Jesse Mano of Boulder, who's a professor at CU of music, and Brett Bowen, who's an incredible player of Arabic music, and yeah, just an incredible lineup of artists. We had a couple of belly dancers, some essential oils happening in one room, and chair massage, and of course this very elaborate buffet spread of Mediterranean food. I think I cooked about 12 different dishes.
Wow.
We had guest speakers, a Sufi priest talking about Rumi from a spiritual perspective, and a literature professor who was one of the founders, co-founder of one of the first women's studies programs at a university in the U.S., and a published author of poems inspired by Rumi, was the other guest speaker, Dorothy Walters, who's also Boulder-based. And so this was the evening, and 100 people showed up.
Wow, that's incredible.
Including the friend who had requested I create an evening that felt like Europe. And she was like, Cara, when I made this suggestion, this was not what I was asking you to do. This is not what I had in mind.
Right.
But this is awesome.
Yeah.
And, Turkish people wandered in, people from different countries somehow found out about it or got invited. It was open to the public, and they were just like, whoa, like, I feel like I'm home, and this is the food that tastes like my region, and this is my music, and this is my culture, and that was very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because Boulder is not always necessarily offering that.
Sure.
Islamic community or the Arabic community. And so, yeah, it was a super fun night. It totally matched the vision I had in my head of what I thought I was creating, which even today I can say is a rare occurrence and a delightful one. Things don't always turn out exactly as planned.
Of course.
And sometimes that's a good thing and you're pleasantly surprised. But when it does, it's pretty spectacular to realize that and actualize it in exactly from the picture you had in your head. So that happened, and I was like, holy shit, this is fun.
Right.
Let's do more of this. People are obviously hungry for it, because my first go at it, 100 people are in the room, all barefoot and crowding in, and that made it feel all the more authentically Middle Eastern. Everybody's sort of huddled together on the floor and in chairs and on the rugs and cushions and pillows, and I mean, you could barely walk in the room. It was so packed and crowded, and people of all ages. I think the age span was something like 17 to 87.
Wow.
And there were professors of various departments. There were undergrads and grads and yoga instructors and rock climbers and artists and philosophers of science and architects and doctors and, I mean, the whole gamut of folks were there interacting with one another and talking about Rumi and reading each other poems and eating good food. And it was a night to be remembered, and a night I fondly look back on. So I couldn't wait to do more. So the next month, 4 weeks later, I did Dinner with Da Vinci, which was invited people to step into Da Vinci's workshop and see what that might feel like. Wow. So that went even bigger. We had a Renaissance choir and
oh my God.
Different chefs doing different courses of Italian food. I cooked a recipe from one of Da Vinci's own journals. He used to notate recipes. He was vegetarian, probably because he was operating on, or not operating, but probably because he was cutting up cadavers, right. To draw them and research them, but who knows. Anyway, Dinner with Da Vinci also was like, I think 130 people were there, including the choir. It was high demand for Boulder, so I enjoyed continuing this experiment and eventually, got back onto my career path in terms of earning income and being busy with work obligations. So then it became more of a hobby for a while, because though well attended, I hadn't yet riddled out how to, if I were making it into a business, it would take some time to invest in that and systemize it well. And I preferred just enjoying the artistic process and breaking even and letting it be what it was without too much admin having to be devoted to it. And so it became a hobby for a number of years to just create these evenings. I eventually scaled down a little bit and made it less of a theatrical production, and began to just focus on interesting topics and diverse groups of people coming together. So that series was really fun to do it on historical figures that are still relevant to our times.
Right, of course.
So that was a 3-part series, which included Rumi, Da Vinci, and then Jane Austen. Okay. And then I veered into more cultural themes. I did one on what was it called? Like the Brazilian art of love and chocolate. It was a Valentine's Day salon, and that was exploring erotic poetry of Brazil and chocolate.
Both incredible things, yeah.
Then I think I did one on gypsy culture and flamenco from Spain. And then I started doing more topic-based salons that were a little smaller and more intimate, like maybe 20 to 30 people at a time. And those were, one of my favorites was people who question the value of their own culture. And how do we know when a cultural value is still relevant and worth passing on to the next generation? And how do we know when it's no longer relevant and needs to be let go of? And how do we decipher between a cultural value and a universal truth? So that was a 3-part topic. Wow. Led by my friend Yuval Leor, who was the guest speaker and facilitator, who is a PhD in cultural studies with an emphasis on world religions and cult psychology. And he's an Israeli who's pro-Palestine, a very interesting guy for that topic. So that was a fun night. And eventually I moved to Paris and started doing events there with Café de la Culture and kind of brought it full circle. And some of those events, I've done series of ongoing monthly events when in Paris called La Soirée Bohème à Montmartre, and that's an evening for artists of all genres and mediums to come together, and aficionados, people who appreciate the arts, to just intermingle, intersect, co-create, collaborate,
Right.
exchange, share, and so those are very fun nights. And then I've done a couple of salons philosophiques where we've had a central theme and a multi-course dinner and guest speakers and artistic performances on topics relating to French history and culture.
Nice.
Usually feminist ones. So that is how it all began. And
It's incredible, yeah.
And it's now taking on a new form in this current project.
Right. And before we dive into that, one thing I wanted to say is I wish I knew you back then when you're doing these events in Boulder, Colorado, because, like, I have to say, you were literally bringing to the table and doing, like, everything that I love that I didn't even realize, like, at the time that I was, like, desperately in need for. Usually my only way I could satisfy any creative outlet was with these spoken word events, which are nice, but I think a little limited. And with what you're doing, you're bringing in things that like satisfy even like all the senses, like with sight and smell and hearing and all that. It's like, oh man, I would have been in love with that with those events. And actually, I remember now how I first heard about you. I was having a conversation with Trent. He was my first guest on this podcast, and he was telling me about one of the past events you had with Café de la Culture about philosophy and what does it mean to be human, and you had brought together I think different neuroscientists and had this incredible discussion, and I'm like, how do I get in on this? Like, how do I participate or just witness this? Because it's just, I've been looking for something for so long like that. So I just think it's so incredible, Café de la Culture and what you're doing. I really love it.
Awesome. Well, I wish you knew me back then too, and we'd be probably collaborators by now.
Probably, honestly. I mean, I love music, composing music, and then writing, and I want to start learning dance now. I don't even know where to begin, but when I went to a spoken word event last Wednesday in Boulder, it was at this dance studio, and I arrived an hour early, and everyone was like in sweatpants, and I thought, like, okay, I'm at the wrong place, I don't know, and it was all these high school and college dancers, and they're so incredible, and so I was an hour early, so I had an hour just like to watch them, I guess, and I don't even know what kind of dance they're doing. They said it's like feminist hip hop. I don't know what that means, but it was incredible, and so I dislocated my knee unfortunately in soccer recently, so I can't move that much. I can move a little bit, but once I'm recovered, I definitely want to go deeper into dance. But
awesome. Well, yeah. Feminist hip hop can only mean good things.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, dance is an incredible portal into culture,
yes.
And as is most art forms, if not all. But I think dance is a language, and yes. It's a way to know a culture intimately,
right?
And because so much culturally is put into the dance forms of any community of people, and it's such a specific expression of history and experience and perspective and relationships. So yeah, good thing to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess now, chronicling now the next chapter in your life and the next journey, as an artist, and what exactly is the Courageous Vulnerability Tour, and how's that been going?
So Courageous Vulnerability is a term coined by Brené Brown, who is a research scientist and has given some really phenomenal TED Talks that have gone viral. And a lot of her work and research is on the topic of vulnerability and how that translates into power. The ability to be vulnerable and to open up and show your deepest self to others. Right. So I'm a fan of her work. I think that term that she came up with is a very poignant one for our times and very important in correlation with the Me Too movement,
right,
and national conversation, and now international conversation. So, you know, I created so parallel to the Café de la Culture project,
mm-hmm.
I have been doing work in gender studies and women's and girls' empowerment for about 10 years. And so a few years prior to beginning Café de la Culture, I took a trip to Bahia, Brazil, where I had already done a lot of travel throughout Brazil, but this was a more specific trip because I was going there with a small grant I had received from an anonymous donor to do to offer an enrichment program through the arts for Brazilian kids. I was going as an independent artist, so
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't with an organization. I didn't have a plan, and I just had $5,000 in my hand and a ticket to Brazil.
Okay.
And beyond that, I had no idea what I was going to do.
Huh.
But I had already been working with youth in New York and Colorado for a lot of years, through 12, through my theater company, my work in public education, and my summer camps. So I was very passionate about working with youth and building community for youth through the arts. So I knew I was going to do something of that vein, but I didn't know where or how. And I spent the first few weeks traveling by land throughout different towns and villages and cities all over the east coast of Brazil and inland in Minas Gerais and Bahia. And I was just sort of exploring and trying to figure out, you know, where the inspiration was going to come from and what was going to speak to me and what community might be receptive to what I could offer. And so I was just sort of traveling on a local level, you know, staying in people's homes and riding buses and trying to figure it out. And I had a boyfriend from Bahia at the time who I was traveling with, who was traveling with me. He was kind of along for the ride.
You impressed him, and then he's like, I gotta follow this woman. She's incredible.
Who knows? Either that or he was hoping for a visa to the U.S.
That too.
Which is probably more likely the case, unfortunately. Though I probably wasn't aware of that at the time.
Oh, okay.
But at any rate, he was certainly curious as to what I was up to.
Sure.
And certainly willing to be a part of it. And I, at one point, we stopped through, you know, that actually is an important thing to mention about the boyfriend and the visa, because I think a lot of women, you know, in doing this work, focusing on women, that's a lot of women fall prey to that. And certainly in developing countries, that's a frequent theme of falling madly in love with someone and thinking you're having a real relationship, only to discover that there's a hidden agenda. And you know, that's a whole nother topic, but certainly something that some men and a lot of women encounter in their travels.
Yeah.
And you know, those agendas can be varying, but in this case, I'm pretty sure that was an element. So, but anyway, at some point we were passing through or near a town where one of his siblings lived. So we visited and stayed with his sister in Bahia, in a very small village of mostly low-income, middle-class residents. And she was a teacher and asked me if I would come to a couple of her local schools and talk to classrooms of kids about life in America. Now, Brazilians tend to idolize American culture, as many countries in the developing world do, through, you know, media and MTV and Hollywood films and so forth. So the Brazilian attitude culturally at the time was that Americans, are the bomb and we have it made and
Right.
we're all living these incredible high-class lives and driving fast cars.
Yep.
And so she wanted me to basically, I think her invitation was more of the vein of like, come in and tell the kids how amazing it is to be an American.
Oh, wow.
Which is not my mindset. I certainly love my country,
right.
and I am very grateful to be of this place on many levels, but I also have many criticisms of this country, and feel that culturally it can be rather destructive to many people. So I and politically. So I that was not my intention. I wasn't interested in going into junior high and high school classrooms telling kids how great I am because I'm an American. What I found myself talking about was, I think by that point I had spent enough weeks on the road and seen enough of the condition of women in the country and girls, and I was witnessing how undervalued education is in Latin culture for girls. I was witnessing a level of sexual exploitation for girls and women that I hadn't previously been cognitive of in my other travels to Brazil, mostly because I was in tourist mode and party mode and, there for carnival or to visit relatives and, hadn't really taken a deeper look into some of the shadow sides of the culture. But on this trip, I was seeing more deeply the nuances and paradoxes of things that I love about Brazilian culture that had a darker side to them. And it was mostly pertaining to women, what I was tuning into and the condition for women and girls. And I was becoming increasingly startled and shocked by what I was witnessing. And what I found myself talking about in these classrooms was how at the time I was 29 years old, and I was living in my own house in upstate New York and driving my own car and working for my own business, and that didn't exist. No one I interacted with in this time of visiting cities and towns in Bahia and Brazil, no one local, who wasn't a European or American expat, had ever heard of a woman reaching the age of 29 without having been pregnant or been a wife. And they were somewhat distrustful and in disbelief that could be true. And many people assumed that I was lying about my age and was younger than I was saying I was. But they literally couldn't wrap their head around it. And also there's no reality for most girls and women in Brazil of living independently. You live with your parents until you get married, and then you move in with your spouse. And so I was a total anomaly in that way of having reached the very ripe age of 29 and still being single and motherless or childless and coming and going and traveling abroad alone and living alone in a house. People were like, that's not safe. How do you protect yourself? Isn't that dangerous? What if you fall in the shower? What would you do? Or, they couldn't. So I was drawn to talk to teenage girls about how much I enjoy living an independent lifestyle and how that's been a chosen lifestyle for me. And their eyes were wide open, and they they were taking it in with kind of a mixture of maybe mild disbelief and awe and curiosity and perplexity. And then I asked them the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And my impression was, whether true or false, the impression I had at the time was that no one had asked this question before to these kids. Because the way their faces lit up and the way they started gushing with ideas and dreams, and most of them wanted to move to the US and become rock stars and TV stars and actresses, but the way in which they illuminated at that question and couldn't stop talking and rambling, and the way that the boys sitting next to them in class turned to them and looked at them with puzzled faces. Wait, what? That's what's inside of you? I had no idea. Led me to believe that this was not a question frequently asked to girls in these communities, and that was a bit heartbreaking to me, because while no one should know exactly what they're going to be when they grow up necessarily, having dreams about your future and passions, and the idea that you can self-create your path, and become someone you want to be. I mean, who are we if we don't have that freedom of imagination? And the trajectory of girls in Brazil, just like most parts of the world, and certainly low-income girls, is that you grow up and you either become a wife and a mother, or you become a woman of the street, as they call it, which is basically a prostitute. And your value either way is dependent on your sexual appeal to men. Period. It's a Catholic country, so mythology of the Virgin and the whore are prevalent, and that's what you can be as a woman. You can, dabble in education if you want to. It's not that important, unless you happen to come from a family that values that, in which case you're really lucky. Or you happen to come from a family with means that can, give you good connections, but otherwise, it's fairly irrelevant what education you have, and it's all about your sexuality. And so, I was discovering this as I traveled and coming in with a tremendous amount of naivete, even as the Brazilian American. I just had no idea the depths of this for women and girls, and I was realizing quickly that this is a microcosm of the world, and not only that, but that what I was seeing in terms of day-to-day and experiencing as a woman living there for these months, in the day-to-day experience of dealing with and witnessing sexual harassment and assault, and I couldn't go to the grocery store in Bahia without being manhandled by people, and there was something that's incredibly emotionally and physically and psychologically draining to deal with that level, to deal with harassment, period, but to deal with it all day, every day, wherever you are. And as an American in Brazil, I was sort of getting woke, and to the levels of sexism that are prevalent in the world. And yet there was a voice inside of me that knew this is not all foreign. There's some theme here that corresponds with something I'm not fully conscious of yet, but that I've experienced at home in my own community and communities. And I realized that, what I experienced in the U.S. growing up female was perhaps, in my case, more subtle than what I was experiencing in Brazil, but still of the same cloth. And of course, there are many American women who have a lot less subtle experiences of harassment and assault from childhood and beyond, or we wouldn't have the statistics that we have, which is pretty much close to every woman in the United States having experienced some encounter of one or the other or both. The documented statistics are 1 in 4,
Right.
but those are only the women who are willing or capable or able to come forward and report it. So among the women I know, I believe it to be about 99.9%.
Right.
And so this trip to Brazil was life-changing for me. I ended up finding a community on a remote island in Bahia called Morro do São Paulo, which was just being discovered by tourism, but had previously been an island that had been relatively untouched by outsiders, and just had a very quiet community of Afro-Brazilian farmers living there and raising families there. And it's an island with no motorized vehicles. People get around with mules and wheelbarrows and the occasional tractor. All the streets are dirt paved and sand paved, and mostly people get around by foot. And the local community is very, very poor. The children don't own shoes. They don't own toys. They don't own things. They live in little rural ghettos, and they farm off what land they can, and they carve out little lives, little wages of, this and that. And at the time I arrived, it was, tourism was kind of taking off there, and Europeans and Americans had discovered it and were building hotels and bed and breakfasts and restaurants on the beaches. And the local community was, many of them were getting jobs carting wheelbarrows of people's luggage up and down the hills and cliffs, and, just doing work of, service to the tourist industry in whatever capacity they could without much education. And in my first day visiting the island on that trip, I met some key people who were doing things with youth in the community, with local youth.
Right.
And I talked with them, told them some of my ideas of perhaps trying to do an empowerment program for girls through theater and dance, which is the mediums I had in my toolkit. And and before I knew it, I was offered a community space to do it in, and I wrote a flyer in Portuguese, brought it to a bunch of principals at I went to each corner of the island and visited each elementary school and junior high, gave a stack of flyers to the principals and asked them to hand them out to the girls. And the first day I held class, 23 kids showed up. And they were ages 9 to 14. Most of them walked there by themselves, barefoot, and none of them spoke English fluently, so the whole program had to be in Portuguese. And we created a girls' empowerment program together, myself and these students. And this was a place where they could be safe. They could write poems, create dances, learn dance and improvisational theater, choreograph their own pieces, and have discussions with one another and community and conversation, and dream about their futures. And so that was a 5-day course. We met almost every other day for several hours at a time and built a performance which was then presented to their family and friends. And the performance was named by the students Evolution Féminine, which means feminine evolution. And they presented their own poems and choreography exploring earth, wind, fire, and water, and where they live inside each of us, and each of them. And probably the most powerful moment of that project was watching the mothers watch their daughters on stage, and the look in their eyes of wonder and awe of seeing their daughters confidently illuminating their own artistic expression.
Right.
That was really a moving moment to me. And every moment with the kids was treasure. They were sponges. They were so eager. And ironically, part of the program was teaching them traditional African dances, which, was, to me, ridiculously ironic because I was a white American,
right,
coming into Afro-Brazil to teach Afro-Brazilian kids traditional West African dance.
Pretty funny,
but to them, they didn't see the irony at all. They were hungry and eager
awesome.
and delighted
Beautiful.
to learn and excited to learn new traditions of dance and connect with that, that part of culture. And that wasn't the only dance forms that we did. We did a blend of modern and hip hop and salsa and samba, but my background was heavily in West African dance, so I wanted to share that as well. And I lived with the question after doing that program, did I help or did I hurt? Because as an outsider coming in, ignorant to many aspects of another culture,
right,
you don't really know fully what you're dealing with, in terms of you can't possibly know what people have lived and where they're coming from and what's in their best interest. You can be inspired, you can have good intentions, but you can't really know. And for me, it was all those combinations of things. I was led by a feeling of wanting to give these kids a glimpse of other possibilities of how they could become women in the world and another lens to look through.
Right.
But I had no way. I honestly tried to find a way that the community and program could continue after I left. But I wasn't able to secure that in the time that I was there. And so I had no way to keep a sense of continuity with them. They had very little access to internet, and there was no one I could find in the community who was willing to step up and continue the program on a regular basis. So when I left, that experience left with me, and I was sort of on my way back to the U.S. to go back to my life, and there were some people congratulating me, and the parents were very grateful for the experience for their kids, and some of the community members who understood girls' empowerment. At that time in Brazil, there was no term. Nobody had heard of girls' empowerment. So I was met with a lot of suspicion.
Right.
People were like, what are you, you're corrupting these kids. What are you here doing? Why can't boys be in it? Why is it only girls? You Americans, you're crazy. You think you can come in and corrupt people with your culture. There was a lot of that too. And, I took all of that in and self-examined and wondered, am I helping or hurting? Is this a good thing to be doing? I hope so. It feels like it is. There's deep connection here with these kids, but then I'm leaving and they're staying, and
yeah.
there isn't anyone else offering this to them. And then what? So for 10 years, that question lived inside of me. When I got home, I was actually really traumatized by the day-to-day experience I had lived through in Bahia. So Bahia is a place where in the cities, certainly in the city of Salvador and in Morro de São Paulo where I was, women don't leave the home unescorted. You are not safe to be alone as a woman on the street. So I didn't know that. This was another part of my cultural ignorance and naivete.
Right.
I was walking in thinking, women are safe in the world. I grew up in Woodstock and Boulder, two of the most insulated bubbles you can imagine.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, I had certainly had my run-ins with harassment here and there, but not anything to scale with that. And when I got home to New York, I had full-fledged agoraphobia for the first time in my life.
Wow.
Perhaps for the only time in my life.
Yeah.
And I could not leave my home for about 4 months without fear. And so I stayed home. I went to the library. I made my way to the local library and checked out approximately 100 books over the course of several weeks and months on women's history and women's mythology and the divine feminine and anything I could read related to gender studies and women's history in the U.S. and beyond. And I spent those months at home reading and writing and thinking and exploring, and then realized that what I needed to do was find out how I had been conditioned in my own culture to normalize gender inequality and sexism, and how I may have personalized experiences that I had had that were sexist and discriminatory, thinking that it was me and not a bigger problem. And what I decided was that it would be valuable to hear from the youth of my own hometown and community and explore with them to understand what I may have, how I had been conditioned and developed, but also what was happening for the current upcoming generation. So I rounded up as the next production from my youth theater a group of high school girls at the local public school, and told their parents that I wanted to do an exploration of what it is to grow up female in America today. And we embarked on a creative writing course where I had them do a crash course in women's history of the United States. We looked at current events. We looked at media portrayals of women. We had guest speakers come in, and we journaled. And so they wrote and wrote and wrote, and they thought and they discussed, and that became the show. Their journal entries became the piece, which was called On the Subject of Girls.
Okay.
And so, to skip ahead, that culminated into performances and was a very taboo-breaking piece. And after doing that production, I wondered what would it be like to do that with women of my own adult generation cross-culturally. And that's when I created the Alchemy of Imperfection, which is the show that I'm now touring. And it's a look at it's a look at intersectional feminism and female experiences that defy cultural boundaries and generational boundaries. And I'm pairing that show with a conference panel of well-informed activists, academics, and experts in multi-disciplines and different cultural backgrounds to speak on the topic, how can men support women to speak up and be seen? And so the project, Courageous Vulnerability, coming back full circle, is a combination of the Alchemy of Imperfection theater ensemble piece and the literary salon conference panel format. And so it's an interactive conversation after a thought-provoking piece of theater for social change. And so far, it launched last year out of Paris. It's been to LA and Boulder and Denver, and most recently San Francisco and Portland. And each time I create it, I curate a panel locally, so it's a different combination of people every time, and I cast a different group of artists and actors for the ensemble piece.
Awesome.
And it's a very community building process from start to finish. And I'm super, super excited about what's developed so far and where we're going.
Yeah. Oh, just a quick question I wanted to ask. Oh, that was wonderful. How did you come up with the name The Alchemy of Imperfection? What's the origin of that? Because it's so original.
Yeah, so after doing the project in New York with high school students, I went to Boulder and started doing research. I did some travel abroad, and I was talking with women of many different cultures, comparing notes of, what I understood and had experienced so far in my travels and at home as a female, and in looking at gender disparities and diversity and culture and race and all the intersections of hierarchies and discrimination. And I wanted to understand more from women of other cultures, where there were common themes and shared experiences. So and then I created a task force in Boulder of women like me, American women of different backgrounds, some Jewish, some Mexican, some Middle Eastern descended, some African American, to combine efforts in a research project and meet with me weekly while we explored questions that I had designed to look more deeply into our own psychology as women, as independent women, sort of creating our own career paths. Some of us had been mothers or were having kids, and some of us were single and choosing not to. And so we were sort of exploring, all kinds of questions relating to our emotional lives, our psychology, our relational lives. And what I found was that each week, all these women were so excited to gather together. The age ranges were 20 to 69, I think. And everybody wanted to hear what everybody else had to say, but nobody really wanted to talk.
Oh, interesting.
And when we did talk, myself included, we sugar-coated things. And these were all friends of mine that I kind of had hand-picked and invited to be part of this,
right,
because I found them all to be very woke and self-aware and conscious. And but the ones who I knew were in problematic relationships were saying how amazing their boyfriends were and how great their relationship was. And I'm thinking, I've met your boyfriend. He's kind of a douchebag.
Oh, my God. That's
I don't
so
know why you need to represent this in
right.
this way.
It's interesting.
And those of us who were single, myself included, and pining to be in relationships, were like, oh, it's so awesome to be single.
Yeah, I've been pretty nice. Yeah, it's pretty funny.
So what I realized was each time we'd meet, I'd leave feeling depressed and feeling unfulfilled and rather lonely. And I was like, why do I feel this way? This is what I want to do. This is my project. These are awesome women. And I realized we're not being real with each other, even in a situation where we're being invited to share deeper parts of ourselves and be vulnerable and explore together. We are so conditioned to posturing our perfect lives.
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah.
That we are frozen. We can't do it. And interestingly, it was the youngest member and the oldest member of the group that were the most comfortable sharing more of their raw selves or the mistakes they'd made. But everybody in between was like paralyzed. And I realized, you know what? I gotta try this differently. So the next time we met, I said, look, let's throw out all these questions, because these must not be the right ones, because they're not getting to what I want this to be about. You know, what I really want to know is, where do you feel stuck? Where do you feel confused? Where are you unsure of yourself in your relationship or in your life? And can we open up and talk about that? And as soon as that was clearly stated, everybody got real. And the ones who had the most perfect looking lives were suddenly sharing about having been raped by boyfriends or domestically abused by ex-husbands. And then as soon as they told their story, others told theirs, and the real stuff emerged, and it was a relief, but also really a formative moment for shaping the play, which I was yet to write, and naming it, because I realized, at the core of all of this is this very deep conditioning for women to be perfect.
Yes.
At whatever it is, whatever area they're in, whether that's the perfect wife or the perfect mother or the perfect girlfriend or the
put together,
lover or the perfect executive or the perfect entrepreneur, whatever it is. And how can you be free if that's your mindset? That's a really effective way to inhibit freedom. As an outside force. So I realized that it's in our imperfection that we find freedom. It's in allowing ourselves to not be perfect, and to be awkward and vulnerable and goofy and whatever. And there's tremendous alchemy in that for women, I think. And, men have a different side of the coin. Men have to be powerful. They have to be decision makers. They have to be stoic, and those are destructive paradigms.
And not show emotions too. I think that's the big one.
Stoicism. So this hurts everybody in different ways, these paradigms, but I was obviously focusing more on my own gender, and that's how the show came to be named.
Yeah, it's a beautiful name, and I agree. It's just so important. Like, the person I look up to the most is my mother, and I totally am seeing, like, she's never really told me about the perfectionism thing, but now it's just so obvious. I see her in anything she does, whether to help run my dad's clinic and business, or when she hosts people over, the cooking, cleaning, everything. It's like she's always on, and she's always having to perform, whereas my dad is very loose in a way. And so, and then I realized, that's with all the women that I know. So yeah, I think it's so important, the alchemy of imperfection, and that's so great. And I guess looking forward, what do you have any future visions and goals for what you want to do with the Courageous Vulnerability Tour and things of that nature?
Many.
Sure.
So next steps, basically what I've done so far is create an effective model that can be reproduced community by community in its own organic modular way, so that it's dynamic and fluid and adaptable to the audiences and communities that it meets with. But the modules are there, and having done it in 6 cities for very different communities, it's been impactful and effective and well received every time. So I've been quickly assembling a team, and we are now a behind the scenes team for marketing and media, We are now fundraising for the remainder of this year to bring this event and these Me Too conversations to more and more communities nationwide. We're partnering with universities and college campuses to do residency programs around the Alchemy of Imperfection theater piece, as well as to create courageous vulnerability events on campus. I'm developing curricula and assembly programs for high schools.
Nice.
I am also in the process of designing a podcast that will consist of informal conversations with panelists and activists and experts and academics in nonprofit sectors and academic fields that are doing work on social justice and social change, as well as artists that are participating in these events. I am also building packages for the corporate setting so that HR departments and companies can have these conversations and programs and events at the workplace, where it's so very important and relevant. I am there's a lot of build out going on right now in a lot of different areas and arenas. We're partnering with a lot of nonprofit organizations, city by city and nationwide, to have further outreach and programming for more low-income communities. And then ultimately, this is TED Talks meets Vagina Monologues. That's the model that this is. So it's meant to scale, and we plan to scale big. This is a crucial moment for women's history and reshaping culture and redefining roles and paradigms and social norms. And with the Women's March and the Me Too movement out of Hollywood, and what's been going on in many industries and unveiled in terms of harassment, assault, and discrimination. Women in tech is a huge part of the Me Too conversation. So we're very interested in partnering with tech companies that want to be on the right side of history and the right side of this moment and this movement, and promote women's leadership in tech, promote women's voices, and pay equity, pay equality. We want this to be something that's accessible and available to communities everywhere to come together as diverse groups of people and have constructive conversations that create new vision and move people to insightful action.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's all incredibly important things, of course. I mean, I think that's actually a good place to end our episode. I mean, you've really had an extraordinary life. You're doing really important work. I definitely at one point want to experience, the Courageous Vulnerability Tour if I'm ever in the same city or something of that sort. And I definitely look forward to continuing to see what you do with your life. I mean, it's really extraordinary stuff. So thanks for coming, on the podcast, Cara. This was fantastic.
Thanks so much. And I want to just mention that you can watch videos of panels of courageous vulnerability in each city we've brought it to on our YouTube channel, which is Café de la Culture. And then, of course, can learn more about where we're going next and what we're up to at our website, cafedelaculture.com.
Yeah, and I will put that in the description of the video, that website and the YouTube channel. But
awesome.
Yeah, because actually I'd watched one of them a while ago when I was sick and in bed about I forget what city it was at though. I think it was one of your earlier ones, but it was just fantastic, and just seeing all the diversity of people and guests. It's really good. Yeah. So absolutely, no, I'll post that. But yeah, thanks again. This was great.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Sorry for being long-winded, but when you ask someone who's passionate about what they do, what they're doing, it's hard to be brief.
No, this is what I want. I want long dive stories, into the humans who come on my podcast. So yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks so much.